I'd like to welcome everyone to our session on fraud, cybersecurity, and AI, where they intersect. Fraud, security, and AI are individual topics that have received increasing attention in transaction banking, correspondent banking, trade finance, and payments. This session will focus on the intersection of current fraud trends, how AI is changing the cybersecurity landscape, and how it can help cyber defenders detect and prevent fraud. My name is Deepa Sinha, and I'm SVP for Payments and Financial Crimes and Women in Transaction Banking at BAFT, and I am joined by my colleagues, Charles Banks, Vice President, Manager of Information Security from US Bank, virtually. Michael Timoney from the Federal Reserve Bank, he's VP for Secure Payments. And Sean McArdle from Director of Financial Crimes and Fraud from Guidehouse. I understand that we are what is between you and lunch, so we will try to get through some very important information as efficiently as possible. So before we begin, can we get the polls up on Slido? So if you guys have Slido, please participate. The first question is, how far along is your organization in its cybersecurity strategy? Give it another few seconds here. Okay. Okay, I think it's tapering off a bit. Yeah. All right, so we have about half and half as opposed to there and getting there. So not bad at all. A couple of folks are not even close, but that said, let's go into the next question, and then we're going to discuss all these. Are you aware, the next poll question, please. Are you aware of any scams, deep fakes, or other fraud instances at your organization? Get a few more seconds here. So I'm rather surprised at the no's, because I feel like everybody has at least a customer who has been a victim of a scam, a fraud, some kind of financial crime. So maybe we weren't looking at it in that perspective, but I think that's the perspective we were taking. Well, let's jump into the questions, and these poll questions are kind of woven into these other questions I have for you guys. So let's start with the first one. How are fraud and cybersecurity evolving in today's AI-driven digital landscape? And Sean, can we start with you?
Sure. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I think it's a great question to sort of open this. And I think from like an attack perspective, I think that fraudsters, at least what we've seen, fraudsters are really leveraging Gen AI tools to really accelerate both the scale, the speed, and for a very reduced cost, be able to create like a large volume of attacks. And so one individual person can set up, a sort of a one-stop shop or innovation lab of their own, where they can have code written for them, they can A/B test that code, they can create research functions to go out and check individual targets that they want to go after, to pull in social media information, write up a whole bio or profile, and then they can basically have a Gen AI model execute that code to try to pass through onboarding or other KYC processes, all from sort of a central workstation. Instead of needing a full team, you can basically create a little workshop at home. And from a defense perspective, at least what we're seeing is, historically fraud models looked at, maybe onboarding, authentication, verification, And then, at payment time, right, there was sort of another check on, I guess, sort of the, characteristics around the payment. And what we're seeing is the integration of what I'll call, Charles can probably comment on this too, but log information from cybersecurity, log events, right? So IP information, location information, device information, other timing components that are integrated into fraud models and are part of scoring so that, it evolves more into a continuous monitoring event rather than sort of at a one-time payment. There's this continuous evaluation of whether or not somebody who's in your ecosystem already is now either it's an account takeover situation or it was a, sort of bad actor who snuck into the platform or program.
Thank you, Sean.
Sure.
Charles, can you hear us?
Yes, and hopefully you can hear me. I apologize for the disembodied Max Headroom approach. I don't know if any of you remember Max Headroom, but we are talking about AI. So I will absolutely agree with what Sean just shared, especially when it comes to the volume and the speed of some of the cybersecurity exploits that we're seeing. Because what we're finding is that there is a lowered barrier to entry now that AI is so heavily available for use, where you're doing things, as Sean mentioned, where you're targeting your attacks in a more personalized and specialized way. Based on the information that you've been able to gather, right? You've been able to comb through large swaths of data more efficiently now using AI, which means now that when you're executing an attack, and can be more personalized based on all of the information and the data that you've found online about the individual target, whether that be an individual person or a business itself or a bank. You have a lower barrier to entry, you have more efficiency, that speed. Those are all of the things that we're now, from a cybersecurity perspective, we're having to look at how we're going to leverage AI in the detection of some of those things. How are we speeding up our threat detection? How are we automating using AI some of our response to a lot of the alerts that we're seeing? On average, a financial institution can see millions of cybersecurity alerts within a given month. And on average, I think we see maybe 560 million alerts every month. That's a lot of activity. That's a lot of data. And so using AI to sort of comb through that, so you eliminate false positives, you're not going down a rabbit hole that doesn't lead anywhere. You're using AI to make sure that we also have a highly specialized, and let's call it a more focused approach to how we're responding to our threats.
Thanks, Charles. Next question's for you as well. What are the most concerning trends you've seen or you're seeing at the intersection of fraud and cybersecurity right now?
I would say the biggest is that lowered barrier to entry, right? We've always had to deal with script kiddies, those individuals who may not be as technically savvy, may not be as technically skilled, that wanted to get into the game of hacking, right? Now that you have the ability to, let's say, fill in the blanks in your code using AI, or use AI to, again, pull together a highly specialized attack, that lowered barrier to entry means that we're seeing more, like that volume, that sophistication that we didn't see before. We're seeing that more rapidly being delivered to market when it comes to attacks, which means, and I always like to look at this from two different doorways, right? When you think about cyber attacks, there's a behavioral doorway that then opens it opens up the delivery of that technical payload. And so when it comes to that behavioral doorway, that's the main entry point, right? It's our taking things at face value and letting our guards down and clicking on an email, or responding to the, hey, you didn't pay a toll text message, right? So that increased sophistication and scale of the attacks means that we're going to see more of these behavioral driven attacks that are playing on our trust, right? We're not using zero trust. We're not exercising the behaviors that allow us to recognize when we're being socially engineered. So I think that's it. That's going to be the biggest piece. The biggest concern for us is that there's going to be more of these cyber-driven fraud attacks because of the lowered barrier to entry and the level of sophistication, the evolution of the threats.
Thank you. This next question is actually for all three of you. And we're going to start with Mike. Mike, Why is AI now central to both committing and fighting fraud? And can you provide an example of where AI-enabled fraud, for example, deepfake, synthetic ID fraud, was actually detected?
Sure. So first of all, I'm going to repeat like the previous panelists that the views and opinions are mine and do not represent those of the Federal Reserve. I'll just go blanket Federal Reserve in general. So first of all, both Charles and Sean mentioned it. I think the scalability is one of the options. And for those of you who may not have picked up on it, Charles mentioned tolls. I'm sure a bunch of you in this room, at least in the US, have probably gotten a toll message that literally, hey, you didn't pay a toll, you're going to get a fine, whatever, right? And that, to his point, is what we're seeing today. That's one of the points. They can scale this. It's easy. It doesn't cost a lot. You just have to send it to a phone number, and hopefully some people will click on it, right? So that's what's going on there. But going back, and that from an AI perspective, that's easy to do, right? And so when you start to think about the future, though, if we think about the deep fakes, that's sort of more of the sexy thing that we all hear about. And I'll give an example, and a lot of folks may have heard this one already, but if you think back, 15, 20 years ago when business email compromise really started out, last year in Hong Kong, in January, there was a company there that was, one of the employees was duped for $25 million, right? Now they got most of the money back, but it basically was a business email compromise. He actually got a notice saying, hey, create this payment, and it said for a secret transaction. Well, we've all been trained, right? Don't click on it. Don't follow the secret transaction. You got to let someone know. So he did. He reached out. Well, the next thing you know, the CFO says, okay, sets up a Zoom call, right? They get on the Zoom call. He's got the CFO, other people that he recognizes, and he's in a full conversation with everyone, and they tell him to make the payment. And it's a series of payments, and he makes the series of payments. And it was all a deep fake. So that was a year ago. Well, since that, I've seen multiple more situations that are very similar to that. Now, the problem with that is that's hard to do and hard to scale. But once the fraudsters get it scalable, that's going to be happening all the time. We're not going to see as much business email compromise. We're going to see, I don't know what we call it, but a deep fake compromise.
Incredible. Sean, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll just my comments there, sort of piggyback off the deepfake video. Like if you look at the evolution of, let's say artificial video content, or if you put my somebody else's face over mine in a voice chat, some of the old models would have, people refer to it as sort of like a doll eye effect, where like you could tell something was off, but you weren't really sure. And then models advance to, well, now the eyes move and sort of look in the right spot. And then they advance to, now you have pupil dilation. And so the models that we're running, that could detect deep fakes have to evolve along with, the deep fake model production up to, even now liveness tests, right? So login.gov, other, sort of defense mechanisms have liveness tests, right? You're supposed to do a live video of yourself, and it detects, almost sort of, it's not detectable by humans, but it's that, sort of pulse cadence. You can see, sort of the heartbeat through the skin. Again, it's not visually detectable. Now that can be simulated as well. And so it's this, this cat and mouse game, but it's why fraudsters are using AI technology, because they have to sort of keep up with the defense component. And then from a detection perspective, I think, again, sort of the fraud prevention and detection, you want to use AI for the same reasons, right? To sort of keep up with the fraudsters, but also like the large volume of, at-risk information, right? If you put friction or didn't bank individuals who had compromised credentials, right? I think that would cover 85% of the US population, right? And so you need some mechanism to ingest that information, have it part of your fraud scoring models, but not be sort of the sole driver or rule-based engine. And so I think, again, in this space, you want to leverage that information, but you need an AI scoring model or other components to really capitalize or maximize that. And so it's a, comprehensive model approach.
Wow, interesting. Charles.
No, and I'll agree with Sean, right? How do you use AI for that sort of advanced anomaly detection that you might see, right? Recognizing when the image that you're seeing or even hearing, whether or not that you're able to detect that it's been created by AI, whether those nuances, those small things that allow you to differentiate or detect that you're actually on a Zoom call where 4 out of the 5 individuals on that call have been created by AI. So yeah, I think that detection is important. And even beyond, let's say, the scalability and how easy it is to create a video conference fake. Yeah. Now there's phishing attacks, so video phishing or voice phishing. I'm sorry, voice phishing, where you may get a phone call that sounds very much like a client that you've dealt with or your relationship manager that you're that's helping to close a deal. So we're having to look at those things as well. How do you detect those anomalies? And now that we know AI can also mask those anomalies, we have to understand what's it going to take from us from a context. Honestly, I don't think we'll be able to keep up. I think this is going to advance so rapidly, and there are, again, lower barriers to entry, and the gloves are off, right? The cyber criminals, they don't have regulation and restriction around how they advance their use of AI to create some of these exploits. So we're going to have to get to a point where we are training people and raising their awareness so that they then take into consideration the context in which they're receiving that messaging, whether it's a phone call or a video conference request. What is the context, right? That's what we're going to have to train to, which is why it was heartening to see, well, maybe heartening and disheartening at the same time, when we asked the question, how many of you are aware of a fraud exploit that has happened within your institution? We need to raise that number to the point where we are all aware. We are all aware that these exploits that are out there, whether they're video conference calls that are fake, voice calls that have been created by AI, or even right now we have an insider threat issue where there's the fake IT workers, where people are creating synthetic IDs and then using those to gain employment within U.S. companies. Right. Wow. So North Korea is actively doing that right now. So is the fake IT worker scam, where they're even able to bypass some of those video conference verifications. They're using AI to bypass those verifications. So I think we have to get to a place where we're not only advancing some of our technical tools, especially those driven by AI, but not only advancing the technical tools to help us stop the attacks, but we have to raise the awareness as well and change some of those behaviors. So I think context is everything.
Wow. I mean, this sounds like a full-on arms race.
Yes.
Hashtag financial crime fighter, right?
Yep, it is. And I think that's where if we can force multiply this, right? I know we have a relatively large and dedicated information security services team here at the bank. But for us, it's that force multiplication. How can I take every employee at the bank and recruit them in making sure that they're doing their part to recognize and not fall victim, and help their clients to recognize and not fall victim? That force multiplication, I think, is important.
Absolutely no. What are the limitations of using AI in fraud detection and prevention? Sean, I'm sorry, Charles, you'd mentioned there were some limitations there. How do we avoid over-reliance on it?
Well, I think for me, it's the people piece of it, right? You have to look at it from the standpoint of using AI to enhance the work that our people are doing, right? Look at it as an enhancement as opposed to a replacement, which means that you have to train individuals on how to effectively use AI to enhance and add efficiency, as opposed to, hey, I'm going to put the AI to work at the job of detection, and I'm going to hope that it doesn't hallucinate or provide more false positives for me. So I need to ensure that there's that human element still at play, right? I think a lot of us, there's this idea that the AI will replace jobs, and it may in some cases, but at the same time, especially from a cybersecurity perspective, given the volume that we deal with and the volume that we're going to continue to have to deal with, I think for us is more of how can we use it to enhance. So I think if we look at it that way and don't rely on this ultimate dependency where you have the data dependency, and hoping that there's quality in how the data is being reviewed. Hey, where are your human eyes and let's call them your answer evaluators, your fact checkers? How do we do that? How do we make sure that we keep that human element attached to the process?
Thanks, Charles. Mike, what do you think?
I echo what Charles said. I mean, if I boil it down, I boil it down to three things pretty much. One, it's we shouldn't put all our faith in AI to solve the problem, right? Anyone that's worked in fraud knows that a multi-layered approach is the best way to go, because not everything's going to be solved in one. So I think, it's a complement, as Charles just said. And that's, like I said, most good programs are like that. Secondly, I think the other panel said it as well, have a human in the loop. It's not just don't let the system make your decisions for you. You should have humans still part of that process. And then lastly, I think with any of these models that we have today, you've got to continue to monitor them and audit them to make sure they're still being effective. And the other piece of this is we heard it in the other panel as well, is it's data. You've got to get data. And so the part of a limitation around this too is that the data in is what's important, right? So if you're getting garbage data in, your models aren't going to not be as good, right? So I think there's that human component that we've got to continue to monitor, audit those models, make sure that what they're doing. And so I think that's where, as we move forward, we've got to keep all those things in mind and not over rely on the AI itself.
Sean?
Yeah, I'll just say it's great when your co-panelists give very comprehensive answers and take everything you were going to say. But I think maybe just to add two things. One is, understanding that in a lot of cases, whatever AI models could be scoring models, anomaly detection models, right? They may not react very well to emerging behavior, and sort of recognizing that there's potentially a weakness there. And so that's where this multi-layered approach can come in to sort of, support that. And then, the idea that, especially in the fraud context, because a lot of times alerts happen, as transactions are happening, it can cause downstream friction on customers. And so, it can cause frustration if your transaction gets blocked. I don't know. I mean, I've had like a coffee purchase get blocked because I was traveling, and it's, it's annoying because, morning coffee is very important. And then, secondarily, if some of those things get pushed to a contact center, right, your contact center can be quickly overwhelmed because, there's all these fraud alerts that they have to process or work through. And I think, calibration of your AI system and alert system is very important because it can now take in more information, but that can translate to more alerting activity that then has to be dispositioned and resolved. So it's smarter in some ways, but causes other operational challenges.
Yeah, and Deepa, can I just add into that? I think the contact center is a great thing that we didn't mention. So if you think about AI and if we're letting it generate the rules and that type of thing, it's not as transparent. So I think there is a transparency. We need to understand what those rules are doing. And I think part of the contact center is if that customer calls and they're upset, why did I get declined? Someone needs to know why, right? And if you just let the system decide, you're not even going to look good to your customer. They're going to be upset. And so we got to kind of balance it out to understand what the system's doing so that we can explain it as well.
Yeah, no, I think I'm sorry, go ahead, Charles.
No, I'm sorry, Deepa. No, I was going to, absolutely agree with that. I think, again, that's sort of helping to change some of the behaviors and the expectations so that if you do have a declined coffee purchase, that you maybe, okay, before I call the contact center, understand that this may be occurring, right? Making people aware of some of the things that we're seeing from a fraud and cybersecurity exploit perspective, I think helps with that as well. And especially if we mentioned, being able to detect some of these attacks. Well, what about the novel attacks as well? Those 0 day, this is the first time we're seeing this. Does AI, if we're using AI to detect on those things, does it recognize that? That's where that human element has to come into play, whether it's the analyst that's monitoring or working the alert, or whether it's the contact center banker that says, hey, this is something that we haven't gotten phone calls about before. How do I escalate this up so that, hey, our AI may have missed this new thing. How do we get someone in place to fine tune that? So I think, enough can't be said about having the human element added to this entire process. So
before we even get to the fraud detection of that coffee, which is very important, I agree. We have to work backwards in building the models. They have to know what they're detecting for and why. And that means that's human intervention, because that's what's putting in the logic behind that, and then implementing it and making sure that your customer service centers are aware of why it's being detected and being able to relay that to the customer. And then maybe also include in there, and this is my thought on it, is include more education for customers as to why they're getting these fraud alerts. It's for their protection. And sometimes it's inconvenient, especially with the morning coffee first thing, but it is for their protection and their well-being in the long term. So great. How has the adoption of AI changed your organization's approach to cybersecurity strategy? And Charles, this is for you since you're representing US Bank.
Well, I would say really all it's done for us is created a new attack vector, right? At this point, what we need to understand is that the old standbys, those very successful exploits that have typically taken advantage of behavior, whether it's social engineering attacks that have resulted in an increased or in more sophisticated phishing emails, or text messages, or voice phone calls, or video conference calls. For us, we just now created a new attack vector. That's one standpoint. The other piece to the puzzle is our using AI, as I mentioned earlier on, using AI to detect AI, to add some efficiency around our detections, since we do have such a high volume. How are we using AI to sort of comb through that? But I don't think it's changed things dramatically for us, because we've always been proactive and adaptive, because we've had to, right? We've had to move with to the technological landscape. Did I get disappeared here? Sorry, I may have moved too fast. But we've always had to be proactive and adaptive. We hunt down our threats. We rely on threat intelligence, so we understand what's on the landscape. We actually rely on what we like to consider a fusion concept of operations, where we're talking to our fraud partners, we're talking to our physical security partners, our crisis management partners. So all of those things that are revolving around the cybersecurity space, we're aware of ahead of time, so that we understand how we at some point start building in detection, start building in, again, that new attack vector that's maybe driven by AI. We just have to continue to be a proactive and adaptive, and that's what we are.
Let me just add one thing to that.
Sure,
So this sort of ties in a little bit with, I know this discussion isn't really on insider threats, but that is sort of a fraud component as well. I think you mentioned that, onboarding employees. And I'll tie it into Gen AI a little bit, is, there was an instance project that, for a client of ours that we got called in to evaluate, especially in the fraud context, was, they had used a vendor to onboard investigators for AML, right? It's fairly common practice. And separate from that, they had been piloting a Gen AI implementation around an investigative co-pilot, right? So the investigators would be able to query, an LLM to ask questions about transaction information, KYC information, other things to sort of assist with the investigation, right? And so somebody was able to, through the vendor, get onboarded, right, as though they were employee A, but they're really individual B. And then through the implementation of this tool, and again, this comes back to the design and implementation purpose of these models, they had some controls over what you could access from a KYC perspective in the original case management system, right? So it was the subject of the investigation, maybe the counterparties, but that was it. It was pretty locked down. But the co-pilot was essentially able to be leveraged to query additional data that was outside of those original restrictions. And so you could ask it any sort of KYC related information. It could get, the pictures that the customer had uploaded of themselves, right? Their selfies, their videos, all the transactions they did, their addresses, their PII, all this information. And so there wasn't a specific sort of data breach directly that happened that led to a bad outcome, but that was something that was detected. And so how do you institute controls? But that story is sort of a chain of where weaknesses can enter at various points, right? Where all these things come together. So.
And you actually went into my next question, which is what are the new vulnerabilities, introduced by AI systems? So definitely data breaches is a big one. What else is out there? Charles?
I would say data poisoning is a big one, especially if you were, and I think you have to make sure that your approach to using AI is done in the correct way, right? Don't use open source large language models where you're putting your data in. And you have people in some cases where there's, what we like to call ghost IT, where they're doing those types of things and they're putting data in. I think if we recall back to DeepSeek and their launch, I think there were 16 million individuals that jumped on DeepSeek when it was made available, and then within 3 to 4 days there was a breach, and all of that data was at that point compromised. So I think understanding that the data in, you need to make sure that it stays in, and if there's a possibility that your models are out there, that someone doesn't have the ability to poison your data, so that what you're getting out is now been altered to make you vulnerable, to make your systems vulnerable. So I think data poisoning is a big one. The model stealing and reverse engineering on models is also important for us to be aware of. Now, and one of the things I will say, and this is always, the next question is, okay, well, what do we do about these let's call them these weak spots? Well, there's MITRE, which is a framework that gives you some indications as to what certain attacks look like, what are the techniques and the tactics and techniques that identify those particular types of attacks. Well, MITRE now has one of those frameworks for artificial intelligence. It's Atlas, MITRE Atlas, which is Adversarial Threat Landscape for Artificial Intelligence Systems. Say that fast 10 times. But I think given all of these things that we now have to be concerned about, these new threats driven by these systems, know that there are resources that are out there that are adaptive and proactive and helping us to sort of stay ahead of the game if we can.
Thank you.
Can I add in that one of the weaknesses I would throw out there is just the way that we do our own business. And this is Mike's opinion. Fraudsters don't have the same rules that we do, right? Yeah. So when it comes to tools like AI, they don't have to worry about it. They play with it. They do what they want with it. They experiment. They figure out ways to take advantage of it. We have all these processes in place, which are good, right? They're for the right purpose, but it really makes it slower for us, right? And so, even in my organization, it took us a long time to get there. We were using it in certain areas. Previous organizations I've been part of, they did the same thing, right? It's got to be phased out. You got to evaluate all the risks. We're in a business where we're risk averse, right? So we've got to figure all that out before we get there. Fraudsters don't care about that. They can do it faster. And quite honestly, they have the budget to do it, right? The other thing we got to do within our organizations is get the money to do these things that we want to do. And so it's a little bit more of a challenge. So it is oftentimes trying to catch up to what they're doing.
I feel like this is an age-old thing. I mean, AI is new, obviously, but this is an age-old problem that law enforcement, as well as financial institutions and all, who are trying to prevent fraud, have been dealing with, right? We've got to play by the rules and within the guidelines and the laws.
Privacy
and exactly. And fraudsters don't need to. They do whatever they want to do. So yeah, it's just now shifted over to the AI realm.
It's one. I'm sorry, Sean, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, some of this also comes down to design, right? So if you think of a lot of instances, like chat bots, right, that become available so clients or customers can reach out and interact with chat bots. If you have sort of open-ended chat interface where people can ask any question they want, right, through prompt injection or jailbreaking, you can try to convince an LLM or basically a chat bot to do things that it's not supposed to do, because you convince it you're doing a role-playing exercise, and they're playing the role of some data access individual that you tell them, right? You can stage these whole scenarios and get them to reveal information that they otherwise wouldn't without controls. And so sometimes, for me at least, I've seen instances where you have these interactive chatbots, but they have very strict constraints on the questions or types of things you can ask, and then it defaults and routes you to a human because, right, some institutions put very strict controls on, how much they let a machine essentially drive a conversation, versus in some instances I've seen very open-ended, interfaces or interaction, and it'll retrieve information that, would surprise you if you sort of toy with it or play around with the prompts.
Yeah, the prompt injection attacks are a big concern. I know we've done pipeline or workforce pipeline development for getting high school and college students into the cybersecurity field. And one of the exercises that we go through is using Gandalf. It's a large language model. It's a game that's online, and you have an opportunity to go through and inject prompts and attempt to make this AI give up information like the password or right? If you ask it to create something and it's been told not to create, you can use prompt injections to get it to help you build, let's say, a bomb, right? So I have high school students who are able to go through a prompt injection and crack the Gandalf, the large language model, within 5 minutes, right? So we Mike mentioned the hackers, the cyber criminals, the fraudsters don't have those restrictions that we have. And so if I have a high school student who can crack your large language model and get it to give up information about your processes within 5 minutes, that's the scary piece of it. And it's industry against industry. When you look at the fraud or the cybercrime or the fraud industry, that it is an industry. It's run like an industry. They will have made upward of $10 trillion by the end of this year, right? So it's industry against industry, where we always have to be right? We always have to be right in terms of cybersecurity protections, fraud preventions. They only have to be right one time, right? So I think, yeah, that's the that when we talk about the vulnerabilities, I mentioned Sean mentioned this as well. The volume, the speed, the barrier, the lowered barrier to entry. Those are all things that we have to take into consideration at this point.
It's all doom and gloom. We're done for.
Well, I mean, not quite. We're getting, no, I'm just
So how about this question? What does a strong AI-led fraud prevention and cybersecurity framework look like today? And what kind of collaboration is needed across teams? You have your fraud team, your compliance, your IT, your data science, to make these systems work more effectively. Sean?
Yeah, thanks. I was thinking about a story. I was speaking with a client, we're discussing sort of fraud risk assessment, fraud models. And I said, have you spoken with your cybersecurity team, right, about sort of acquiring some of the data that they have? And they were like, no, we really don't speak very much, right? They see those functions as sort of separate and distinct. And I think, Charles mentioned this earlier about fusion centers. Like, sharing information, I think, is important, but co-locating those teams now becomes important because fraudsters are leveraging information sourced, the deep dark web, right? But there's fraud user guides. Charles mentioned, it's sort of an industry, right? The concept of fraud as a service is a legitimate concern, right? You can go on and buy institution-specific user guides, or just step-by-step for a particular financial institution about how to get onboarded through their KYC system, which products have the biggest weaknesses, right? Maybe it's a mortgage product versus a card product, or, a checking account, for example. There's a package of identity built into it that they can use to put in PII that's been validated, right, to go through onboarding. There's prompts that are designed already to create the deep fake. So somebody doesn't even need to be an expert in most of these things. They can use pre-canned, pre-packaged things that they pay $5, $10, $20 for, and enter an ecosystem and become onboarded as a customer, right? What they do with that after that is, it's sort of what we're trying to discuss today. But I think the idea of being co-located and sharing information allows you to leverage, what your security teams might be identifying, coupled with what your fraud teams typically monitor for, and, basically increase the effectiveness of your program.
That's crazy. I mean, I'm assuming it's not available on Amazon, right?
Not directly.
Yeah, okay. Just checking. But no, this is some, wow, the news just keeps getting better.
Yeah. I'll throw in just one comment on this. I know we're just about out of time, but the larger banks, I mean, the audience we're here today, mostly multinational organizations, so they tend to have bigger fraud organizations, and you tend to see fusion a little bit more in those. The regional banks, they're growing. But in the US, we have 8,000 smaller institutions. And if you talk to a lot of them, they're like, I am the fusion center, because it's, just a couple of people, right? It's the guy that does the fraud, the cyber, the everything, right? And so it's kind of this, I think it's scaled down based on the type of institution, but we're definitely seeing a movement more towards sharing, at least to Sean's point, sharing data across the organization.
Yeah.
Well, there was the gap between trade and payment folks. So BAFT put together a combined conference. Maybe we need to do one for all the different teams out there that deal with AI and fraud, right, and compliance. I'm going to ask one last question. We're out of time. I'm going to ask real quick, what role will generative AI play in both fraud creation and prevention over the next 3 to 5 years? Mike, let's start with you.
I think we're going to just see a continuation of what we see today, but it'll be more evolved. So things around synthetic identity, deep fakes, those types of things. From a fraudster perspective, they'll have ironed out a lot of the wrinkles. So I'll just leave it at that. On the flip side, I think as an organization trying to fight it, we will have better knowledge around it. Hopefully we're further advanced and we'll be able to simulate types of attacks that we anticipate and maybe make us a little bit more proactive. That's my hope.
Sean.
I'll just say ditto since we're at time.
Okay.
That was a good answer.
Charles.
And I will say ditto because it was a fantastic answer. You have to continue to be proactive and adaptive because it's going to move so rapidly that we will have to, in some cases, struggle to keep up. So good way to end it.
Thank you.
Anybody was able to tell that Charles is actually a deep fake.
Yes. Well, my last name is Banks, and I work for a bank, and I'm in cybersecurity. It sounds like you're being socially engineered. I'm signing everyone up for bank accounts. Meet me outside. So.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming to the panels today. I want to thank our wonderful panelists for a great discussion. I'm sorry we didn't have time at the end for Q&A, but we're all around for the rest of the conference. So if you have any, please flag us down. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.